Hey everyone, it's Mr. Robertson, and today we're going to look at how we introduce multiplication in the third grade. One of the first things I do is I introduce students to the idea of a grocery store and how they organize apples, which are represented by the red circles here, into baskets. And so one of the first things I ask the students to do is tell me how they would organize, how they would count the number of apples. And at first some students might say, oh, I can count them one at a time, there's not many apples here. Or some of them will say, oh, there's 3 in the top row, and so they might skip count by 3s. And that's what we want to push students towards, is counting everything in groups. So some students may see these 4 groups of 3. And I'll have them recognize that and then even write the sentence, 4 groups of 3. Now, looking at the same basket below, other students might not see 4 groups of 3. They might see 3 groups of 4. So I'll have them recognize that and write the sentence. At that point, if students are still having some issues recognizing how many groups there are, once you circle them, which they're easily able to do, you can say there is 1, 2, 3, 4 groups, and then the of 3 represents how many is inside of each group. And so down here you've circled 1, 2, 3 groups, and there are 4 inside of each group. Looking again at the same group of apples, I'll have students come up with even more ways to organize the apples into groups. And so many students might actually start looking at it, for instance, and say, well, I noticed that right here is one group of 4, here is a second group of 4, and then there's a third group of 4. So once again, you have 3 groups with 4 in each group. Other students may even look at it more differently than that. Oh, whoops. And those students may look at it as there's one group of 2, 2 groups, and organize these into groups of 2. Groups of 2 means that there is 2 inside of each group. So you have 1 group, 2, 3, 4, 5. You end up having 6 groups, and there's 2 in each group, so it's groups of 2. So with each grouping that I give students, or each basket of whether it be apples, pears, or lemons, I ask students to find out as many different ways to group it as they can, and then to write these sentences right here. Because later in the week, students will start learning how different the multiplication equation is and what it really means in comparison to addition and subtraction equations. For instance, 6 groups of 2 is really just the expanded way of saying 6 times 2. Because there are 6 groups of 2 in this scenario. Of course, some students, if you give them the freedom to group as they see fit, may end up with leftovers. In this scenario, for instance, they are still working at groups of 2, and so they end up having 1, 2, 3, 4 groups, but then there's a group of 1 here, so they have 4 groups of 2, so there's 2 in each group, and then they have 1 group of 1. The important thing here again is that students recognize different ways to organize groups and what groups of something means. That 4 groups of 2 means that there are 4 groups, and that of 2 means there are 2 of something in each group. It is also important to note that having a leftover group of 1 here, or a group that is not equal to the other groups, is not a problem. It is a situation that many students will run into when we begin mixing multiplication and division problems. And by seeing this situation now in a very safe environment, students will feel more comfortable with the situation later on down the road. Looking back at our earlier example, we are now going to write equations for these sets as well. The important thing to note here is that the 4 groups is one of the numbers in the equation. So that would be our 4 is our groups. The multiplication symbol that we usually say times, right now we're going to refer to as being the same as saying groups of, and then 3. So 4 groups of 3 is represented with this model. And here we have 3 groups of 4. Later in the semester, students will use these types of models, which we will later refer to as arrays, to solve multiple types of word problems and use it in problem-solving situations. Students will also start being able to break down very complex word problems that involve multiplication and division by thinking of groups and how groups of things apply to both situations.